Do you ever feel like you just aren't getting your fur to look very realistic? You try and it still doesn't come out right? Well, you don't have to be on that hamster wheel again, because I'm going to share with you some key tips to get you drawing epic realistic fur. Just by doing these, they will have a significant impact on how real your drawings look. But there will still be ugly drawing stages because we all have them. When you first start your drawing, you're trying to work in that base layer. That's a common practice that a lot of us colored pencil artists do. There is, however, just one thing that you need to be making sure that you're doing. This one thing isn't something that you have to get absolute perfection on in order for your drawings to turn out super realistic in the end. Really, you only need about 50% accuracy for it to help your drawing. And that's because, of course, this is only one step in the process to getting that epic realistic fur. That 50% accuracy that you need to be getting with your base layer is to pinpoint the highlighted hairs for your base layer. See these right here? These hairs right there. Not the dark hairs, the light hairs. When I'm starting off a drawing, the first thing that I am doing is looking at my reference photo and pinpointing all of the highlighted hairs for every single area of my drawing. Now, this can seem quite complicated, of course, especially when you're working on a really large drawing, but all you have to do is just simplify each of those areas, focus on working on one area at a time to help you from feeling overwhelmed. So say you start off on an area where the eye is. You work in the eye and you start working in the area around the eye. So if this is your goal area to finish, then you want to pinpoint the highlighted hairs for this entire little section, the eye and the area maybe 1 to 2 inches away from the eye. You want to try and match your drawing to those highlighted colors and values. The highlights on top of an eyebrow, for example, those hairs are going to be a different color and value than the hairs underneath the eye. To try and get an accurate color representation for these highlighted hairs and all the different varying areas within even a small area of your drawing can be quite complicated. And that's why it's really only necessary that you try to get this at least 50% correct, because you're going to end up doing a lot of other steps in the end that are going to get your drawing looking realistic. But getting at least that 50% accuracy will really help boost your fur in it looking realistic once you start drawing in those first stroke layers. Now, what happens when you don't take this step with your drawings? Well, in some cases, it really doesn't negatively impact them too much, but oftentimes what it does is you'll be drawing all of those darker values in with your regular drawing process, and then you're trying to fill in those highlighted sections as well, all of them mixing together, drawn over the top of each other. And we already know that light layers of colored pencils don't really go over dark layers very well. And then when you do draw light layers over the dark layers, they tend to kind of white them out a little bit. They make them dull. They're not as crisp and dark. And that can negatively impact the values of your drawing, which is extremely important in it looking realistic. You want those values to be as accurate as possible. This, of course, is another step you're going to want to take to get your drawings to look realistic. Throughout the entire drawing process, you should be always checking your values. When you finish that base layer after pinpointing all of your highlighted hairs and get that in, check your values. Compare those highlighted hairs that you've tried to match and what you've got on your drawing and see how accurate they are. Make the necessary changes that you think you need to make, and when you think you've got it, you don't. Check again. That's literally the entire process to drawing, is checking and checking and checking. Saying, nope, I don't have that right. I need to change that. I need to change this. And most of the time what you're trying to change, or what I'm trying to change with my drawings, is always evaluating those values and making the changes that I need to make them usually darker, but sometimes lighter too. Depends on what I'm doing. Now, remember what I said about pinpointing those highlighted hairs and aiming for at least 50% accuracy? That's perfectly okay, because once you check that base layer, oftentimes, especially with me, this happens to me all the time, I've got my base layer down, I think it's good, and I check it again and it's not. So I have to add another layer on top of my base layer to try and get those values a little more accurate to what I'm seeing for those highlighted hairs. And 9 times out of 10, even when I do that, those highlighted hairs that I think are pretty accurate aren't accurate. And you know what though? That's all totally okay. We all have those days when we're just off. We don't do things quite as well as we would some other day. The great thing is though that there are lots of other steps that you can apply to get your drawing to where it needs to be. Just because you get one or two things not completely as accurate as you would have liked doesn't mean it's the end of your drawing and it's not going to end up looking real in the end. Out of all of those other things you can do with your drawings to help them look realistic, regardless of whatever mistakes you made before that, there are a couple of different ways to draw fur. Now, I'm not talking about the different types of fur, like say straight, wavy, or curly, or long fur. I'm just talking about different methods to drawing fur. The first can be applied when you're trying to draw fur in a highly detailed way, which oftentimes is how we want a lot of our drawing to look. This involves drawing a series of fur strokes to create those realistic looking hairs. And to do this, you want to draw a series of repetitive fur strokes, slightly overlapping one another so that it creates a nice realistic curvature to those hairs. That is what I consider a pattern, and the next step that you're trying to do with that is do the repetition of that pattern. Now, the pattern doesn't have to be exact. Oftentimes you don't want them to be exact because you want all of the hairs to all be different from one another. The next step after that is to draw them overlapping. So that way you get a nice carpet of hair. And then of course for colored pencils, you're going to be repeating this same process with the different colors that you need for the fur. So that would be different colors for the highlights, midtones, and shadows. And additionally, sometimes you need to have multiple colors in order to create the colors for those highlights, midtones, or shadows. Another method to drawing fur is by drawing just shapes. Now, this often is a method that I use with all of my drawings. I particularly use this in areas on the outskirts of my animal that isn't going to be in so much focus as the focal point, which is usually the face of the animal. As I work my way out in the details of my drawing, I start drawing in this shapely manner for fur instead of trying to draw a bunch of those specific hairy details. The first step for drawing fur like this is very similar to the other method, repetitive overlapping of those fur stroke patterns. But this time you're wanting to go more for a shapely look to your fur than individual hair looking. So this involves doing a bunch of blunt strokes. Of course, using a blunt pencil will also help you, but you're trying to draw a bunch of overlapping strokes that kind of equal a shape or clumping type of structure to the fur. Now, this clumping type of structure is something you want to be getting with the highlights and midtones as well as the shadows. When you are drawing all of these blunt strokes, you are in essence creating the shadows, and those shadows are also creating the highlighted clumping structures that you will actually know to be the fur when the drawing's done. Now, oftentimes when it comes to drawing fur in this more shapely type of way, it's a lot more complicated in trying to get those values right because it's a series of trying to work up enough layers, and there's all types of different varying directions and flows that the fur goes as it's clumping together, and all those different values as well. And this is why it's important to work slowly and build up a lot of those layers and using multiple colors for the highlights, midtones, and shadows. You're going to also want to do plenty of fill layers, which just means that you've kind of got your area blocked out already. You have highlights, midtones, and shadows, but you do need to still work on it and add in color. So you want to add in color over the top of those. It can take a number of fill layers to get the accuracy that the area needs. I guess another term for this would be like glazing. The best approach that I've found to try and getting this way of drawing fur right is to build up that structure and getting majority of the correct values in, and then adding in those color layers afterwards, because you don't know where to put everything if you don't have that structure first. Now, I've included a short tutorial for you guys of a dog's eye. And additionally, to go along with this dog eye, you can get the full real-time tutorial version of this German Shepherd that the eye belongs to by signing up at patreon.com/Jessica Matheny. There's a link to my Patreon in the video description as well as on the screen at the end of this video. Now, let's get started on this short tutorial. I'm going to start off by using burnt sienna to fill in a base for the eye. Then I'm going to add some sanguine. Then I'm going to blend that out. For the reflection in the eye, I'm going to add some ultramarine. Then I'm going to add some indanthrene blue and then top it off by using some warm gray 5. Now I'm going to start adding in the black shadows around the eye using black. And then I'm going to go ahead and blend that. Now I want to start working in the shadows for the eye using walnut brown. Then I'm going to add a little white highlight and use black to finish off those shadows in the eye and try and make them darker. Using brown ochre, I'm going to add some yellow to the eye and a little bit more sanguine. Now I'm going to add another layer to those black shadows. I'm going to start filling in the base for the fur using burnt ochre. Now I want to add a little bit of red in there, so I'm going to use some burnt sienna. I'm going to add some sanguine to this inner part of the eye here because it's a little bit more red. Using cold gray 2, I'm going to add this in as a base for around the eye. I want to add a little bit of a darker value to the area around the eye, so I'm going to add some warm gray 2. I'm just going to add a little bit more burnt ochre. And for the skin around the eye, I'm going to add a layer of light ultramarine and then some deaf blue. To darken out the values, I'm going to use cold gray 4. Then I'm going to go ahead and blend this out. Now I'm just going to add in this upper section using those same colors, warm gray 2 and burnt ochre. I'm going to add a final layer of black to the shadows around the eye. And then I'm going to start working in some of those shadows into the skin around the eye. As I'm drawing this skin around the edges is when the fur starts, so it's important to try and draw fur-like strokes as that skin starts to taper into the fur. Now I'm going to start adding in my first fur layer using burnt ochre. With this fur layer, I'm more worried about trying to just get the overall area of where this color is and have a slight indication of some of those fur strokes rather than having pinpoint high detail hairs because it's not necessary for that. Really, the color is just the more important part. In order to better keep track of where I need to put things at, I'm going to fill in really quickly the black section of fur along this eyebrow. Now I'm going to go back to using burnt ochre to continue drawing more fur strokes. I'm now going to start adding in another layer of fur strokes using burnt sienna. This is going to be more of a mid-tonal value, which when you're drawing fur, it's important to have all three values: highlights, midtones, and shadows. As I'm working my way through this fur, I'm paying very close attention to all of the different changes of the direction of the fur from the reference photo that I'm using, as well as the fur length. It's important that you get all of these accurate, so that way you'll have a really nice realistic look to the fur when it's all finished. If you have unrealistic lengths to your fur or the directions, you're going to notice when the drawing's finished that things are just off. Now I'm going to start adding in a shadow fur stroke layer using walnut brown. When I'm adding my shadow layers in, I'm not really just drawing them exactly everywhere. I'm paying close attention to the different types of patterns with those shadows that I see in the reference photo. So I'm trying to spot out the areas where these shadows are more prevalent, and I'm trying to put them kind of in those same areas. I'm not drawing exactly to the reference photo, I'm just trying to copy a likeness. Now I'm going to use black to start drawing in the darkest shadows to the fur. Oftentimes, black isn't always heavily present as a shadow in fur, it's only in specific areas. So it's important to not go overboard when using this. And make sure that you only use it in the areas where there are actually black shadows. Now that I've kind of gotten all of the stages of my drawing filled in, I am going to check my values. I'm going to look at my reference photo and try to pinpoint the areas that I need to adjust and what I need to change about them. And usually it's about adding darker values in. So I'm going to be using walnut brown to add in some darker shadows where those are necessary, as well as adding in a little bit more of that burnt ochre to get more color in where it's necessary. If you want to draw more of this dog than just the eye, get the full real-time version of this German Shepherd tutorial by signing up at patreon.com/JessicaMatheny. There's a link right here on the screen, or you can watch more fur drawing tips from the bottom right video. See you next time!